We're just giving people another minute to join and then we'll get started. Good morning.
Oh, hello.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I have an earbud, I wasn't sure.
We're just giving people another minute to join and then we'll get started. So it's probably hard to tell if the earbuds are working if we're not talking.
That makes sense. I was like, oh no, I'm late. I'm home with my two kids today, so if you see a little minor drop up here like a rafter and go, that's fine.
And can everyone see the slides?
Welcome everyone. Happy Friday. We'll go ahead and kind of get us started. We might have some folks trickle in still, but it's Friday and we wanted to kind of get started with this meeting by sharing a highlight from the week or something that you're looking forward to this weekend. It is rainy on my side of town this morning, but it's been a pretty warm week. So I honestly haven't looked at what's coming this weekend. And if anything, I'm just looking forward to some rest. So I'd love to, please in the chat, let us know what you're looking forward to or your highlight of the week. It's one of my favorite activities, just like what's the highlight of the week or the day. And we'll also use this time to just kind of remind everyone to take care of yourselves as we go through this meeting. We do have 2 hours of conversation and information sharing. We encourage you to use your camera, but of course understand that it might not always be possible. And we'll kind of just keep the same structure that we've been using and really looking forward to having these conversations with you. This is our second to last meeting. So we've just learned so much from each other and have been able to learn a lot and gather a lot of your feedback. So just super, super happy to have you back. And I would love reading what people are dropping in. It says, ooh, nephew's graduating this weekend. That's exciting. It's graduation season. Picking strawberries, delicious. Oh, that just sounds so good. I had some strawberry plants, but they haven't survived this last. It was like 2 years. They kind of slowly died away. So probably need to get some back. Going to get Mexican food at my in-laws. Yum. Yay, celebrations. 5 boys in the house, Carrie. Good luck. Oh, beach time. Even if rainy, the beach is just so beautiful and I love it. So Leslie, hopefully that's really, really enjoyable for you. Decorating infant room, Blanca, that sounds so fun and precious. Friends, twins have their 3rd birthday on Saturday and volunteering for community action outreach on Sunday. Oh, love it. Spending time in community and volunteering. Open pools already? Okay, this is just too much fun. Everybody's having so much fun. I love seeing that, what people are looking forward to. I think we all just really, really enjoy the summer, the sunshine. So this is beautiful. Oh, dirty hands in the garden. Yes. Yes, I think I heard from Katrina earlier this week, got some gardening done. So I just want to appreciate all you green thumbs because definitely don't have one on this side. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing this. It's just nice to kind of be able to learn a little bit more what folks are looking forward to and what brings everybody joy. So this is great. We'll go over and move on to our agenda, and feel free if you haven't shared yet to keep putting in, sharing in the chat. Well, excuse my dog while she tugs at me over here. For today's agenda, we're going to do a summary of meeting 3 feedback as we have done. So Katrina will be sharing with us some of the summarized feedback that we received during the last meeting. And we'll have 2 advisory conversations. The first will be like rule set items related to regional service providers of the Iecmhc. And then the second conversation will be defining 4 terms from the legislation. And those include anti-racist, implicit bias, anti-bias education, and anti-bias practices. And then for the last step, we'll kind of just talk a little bit about what we can expect for our 5th meeting, which we plan to be our final one. And to remind ourselves about facilitation principles, these have been really helpful and important for us to share each time. And that is always moving forward with hope, believing that a better future is possible. And I think that we've all been able to really bring that into this space and think about what is possible and what we can imagine for ourselves as, as professionals, as providers, as educators, and for the families and children, and honoring the collective wisdom of this group. We've just heard amazing experiences and just knowledge, and really, really appreciate for what everybody has brought so far. And honoring that equity is at the heart of this effort. And lastly, we've anticipated experiencing that discomfort. Some of us may have felt it, and really just want to remind everyone that our priority is for everybody to feel safe in this space and to center the space as your own, because we're here to hear from you all more than anything. So thank you.
And I think you're used to seeing the group agreements that you helped us create at the beginning. This is the 3rd time we've been able to put them in front of you. So just re-ground ourselves that you all are hoping from one another a way of being and present in the meeting and being respectful of one another's lived experiences and ideas, that we're here to understand and learn from one another. And really all of us are looking out to give others an opportunity to speak, and at the same time respecting privacy and confidentiality while really giving advice for what should be in the rules around this work. And that we're really thinking about hope and being strength-based, thinking about our space together as shared, and that we're really trying to reflect on our own bias as well as learn from others. So we really appreciate this group of agreements that you helped us form, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with future groups as they kind of generate what they would like from others. So we're going to turn over to Katrina, who's going to share with you what we heard and received back in the ideas boards from last meeting's conversations.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you everyone for being here. Before I jump into the reviewing from last week, I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is for if you were here last week and you already filled this out, you don't need to do it again. But if you were not able to be here last week, click on that and let us know your preference for breakout groups. We're going to do the same groups as last time, but I know a few of you weren't able to be here, so we wanted to make sure that you have that again. Okay, so let me get this out of the way. Okay, so one of the definitions we looked at last time was culturally responsive. And culturally responsive means a person, policy, or approach that is respectful of and relevant to the beliefs, practices, culture, and linguistic needs of diverse populations and communities, whose members identify as having particular cultural or linguistic affiliations by virtue of their place of birth, ancestry, or ethnic origin, religion, preferred language, or language spoken at home. Cultural responsiveness describes the capacity to respond to the issues of diverse communities at the individual, professional, organizational, and systemic levels. A lot of things in there. So what we heard from you, we heard a lot. And I should say that the definition I just read is the one that these comments were in response to. We have not done a revision of the definition yet. So here's what we heard. First of all, what does linguistic affiliations really mean? Should instead name culture or language experiences. Suggestion to add culturally specific to the definitions. That's important for relationship building. Recognizes the beliefs, practices, and culture. Add into the first sentence of the definition some kind of reorganization of the order. Instead of capacity to respond to the issues, quote unquote, issues of diverse communities, change to a more strengths-based language, capacity to respond to the specific needs of diverse communities. Specify approach. Like, what do we mean by approach? It can feel disingenuous or patronizing. Highlight instead the connection to people, community, lived experience. What is the investment in the culture or the community? Another comment about approach, a way of being versus textbook or dictionary definition of approach. Include authentic lived experience as a priority. Question, is there a definition at the state level? And this answer was provided with the comment. Yes, there is a definition at state level of culturally responsive, but we are specifically tailoring these definitions to early childhood. Switch out the word communities with families. A note that we don't mention families at all in this definition. Should the definition stop before, quote, by virtue of their place of birth, ancestry, or ethnic origin, religion, preferred language, or language spoken at? Is it too limiting? And by trying to include in terminology or groups, we unintentionally exclude what groups we don't identify. And when we start to give examples, we accidentally exclude, like not adding gender or religion traditions that might be missed. I appreciate, like, there's such a breadth of responses in this, and I really appreciate hearing all of these. I'm going to make just a couple of quick comments, which is that part of the reason that we do specify, there's a number of different reasons, but part of the reasons that we do specify kind of which groups or all of those different pieces, language, race, ethnic origin, language, we are part, the statute actually calls out that language, and so we're required to use that in some of these. But I think also, like, stepping back from statute, one of the things that we know is that when we don't specify the diversity of those things, like all of those different pieces of identity that we need to take into account, that what our culture tends to do is to eliminate them and de-identify people. So we really want to hold the place for recognizing everybody. There may be some things we can do with the language to make sure that we're not limiting the list. Yeah, Molly, including but not limited to, yeah. Okay, so let's go on. Our next definition was positive racial identity development. There's a lot of D's in that. This means that young children are aware of and experience positive feelings about their racial identity, including feeling good about their biological heritage, physical appearance, cultural affiliation, and personal experiences. This is also a definition that is called out in statute that we're specifically told to define it. So overall approval of the definition, and that it calls out race specifically, which is important. Feeling good about biological heritage feels subjective. There's a number of comments that call that out. Biological heritage, can we also include multiple heritages, or multicultural, just saying heritage and not using the word biological. We have to do a little playing around with some of that language. Does this definition need to be in this rule set right now? It does, because the statute requires us to. How does it connect with the suspension and expulsion ban? So there's a lot of layers to that particular question, which is, more broadly speaking, we're not talking about the ban per se, but about suspension and expulsion. And that there are distinct differences of who is impacted by suspension and expulsion. We could go on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move us along. But happy to talk with anybody individually if you have more questions about that. Let me finish reading that one. Actually, how does it relate to providers and their work? Are we defining or outlining how they'll support positive racial identity? We aren't in rule, but we will down the road when we get to so what do we actually mean about this in practice? Appearance makes more sense to some in this definition than in others. There was a suggested removal elsewhere. Some wondering, does it matter? Do children notice? Children do notice, and what's more is adults notice. What is the provider's role in supporting positive racial identity? Hard to think about what to include without knowing the context. Yes, we'll work on that. Can't comprehend what someone experiences unless you've experienced it. How do we prepare consultants and educators to be mindful? And having something about direct cultural support so that if a person isn't a person of color, that they are successful working with other races. So I really hear a lot of things in this one, a lot of questions about, so what does this mean about how we do this teaching? How do we help children develop positive racial identity? How do we as the grown-ups help? So all of that we're taking notes about that. We'll be working on those strategies. Inclusion. Inclusion means the values, policies, and practices that create opportunities for every young child and their family, regardless of race, appearance, language, or ability, to participate in a broad range of activities and be supported to engage as full members of families, communities, and society. The desired result of inclusion is that all children and their families feel a sense of belonging and membership, develop positive social relationships and friendships, and experience learning that engages the individual child's development. The defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high-quality early childhood programs and services are access, participation, and supports. A lot of feedback on this one. Suggest changing every young child to all young children and families. This brings up the need to have support for providers to best support children with varying needs. Most important is the sense of belonging in this definition. Suggestion to move the last sentence in the current definition to be first would help us to understand more of the rest of it. Whose values are they basing it off? All values are different based on different cultures. There's a state level team around inclusion that also has a definition. It's helpful when definitions align statewide. Inclusive partners, Oregon Department of Education. Yes, there's lots of different definitions, and yes, ideally we'll be as aligned as we can. The defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high quality early childhood programs and services are access, participation, etc. Could or should move to inclusive practices definition, which is the next one. Could this be shorter? That would be nice. Full members of families doesn't sound inclusive, as if they're not full members to begin with. Could it also include the providers doing the work, as in providers want to be included in the inclusion? Yes, actually providers have a key role in inclusion. Take out the clause regardless of race, appearance, language, or ability. I don't like calling out the specifics. Again, that's one of those places where we do need to call out, partly because of statute and partly because of because otherwise we do, it's ironic that we need to put it into words to say regardless of, but the truth is if we don't put it into words, we disregard those things. So wondering if gender identity should be added to this definition. And inclusion means the values, policies, practices, and diversities. And this was a suggested word to add that create, this makes room for more ways to bring people in. All right, I really appreciate the kind of conceptual suggestions as well as the practical like wording suggestions. Inclusive practices means early care and education providers, technical assistance providers, and infant and early childhood mental health consultants intentionally and authentically promote the inclusion of all young children and their families, regardless of race, appearance, language, or ability. The state also needs to have inclusive practice to fund these needs. Is this supposed to be practitioners, not practices? Are we defining who does the inclusive practices or how we do the inclusive practices? Good questions. This is defining neither the who or the how, but the what. And this is also a term that is called out in statute that we're asked to define, is what, when we say that we want to implement inclusive practices, what is it that we're talking about? Moving the following current language from the inclusion definition, so suggestion of moving this, the defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high quality early childhood programs and services or access and participation, move that from inclusion to inclusive practices. Wondering if gender identity should be added to this definition. Inclusion means the values, policies, practices, and diversities that create. This makes room for more ways to bring people in. Right, I saw a couple things in the chat, but I'm not sure. Okay. Oops. All right. The next one is the infant and early childhood mental health consultation draft definition. This means a prevention-based approach that pairs a mental health consultant with adults who work with infants and young children in early care and education programs, such as childcare, preschool, early intervention, culturally specific early learning programs, and other early care and education programs. We actually have a typo here, Iecmhc consultation. We have the extra C is a typo. Consultation employs a culturally responsive, trauma-informed lens to build adults' capacity to strengthen and support the healthy social and emotional development of children. So a lot of good feedback here as well. The wording implies that the child or family is who needs support. The definition also needs to highlight the need to support providers and provider mental health. That sometimes it is, we focus on the child or the quote unquote problem that the child has, when what we need to look at is, or include, is how is the provider doing? Use the term social emotional support versus mental health consultant. The implications of language and culture. Mental health is a very loaded term. I'm going to read through the rest of these and then come back to that one briefly. Reorder some of the wording. Consultation values and employs a culturally responsive lens. About bringing that forward in the definition to highlight that. If there isn't an understanding of local culture, there can be a disconnect about how to support children, families, and providers. How do we look at geographic location? Maybe within the county, but still an hour away. We like that it's prevention-based, culturally responsive, trauma-informed. Could it include multilingual or linguistically responsive too? And support to provider, child, and family. Which consultant is right? Is it the same consultant for everybody and all the different roles? Good questions. Definition states that it is prevention-based, but it sounds like providers contact when close to suspending or expelling. That's not prevention. Right, that's kind of like last minute last minute intervention instead of prevention. And define how providers or parents can ask for support before things escalate, before behaviors are necessitating pending or expelling. That is not prevention. Yeah. And in a little bit, we'll share a slide that kind of outlines what this might look like. But just to come back to the comment about social emotional support versus mental health consultant, I agree, and I hear that mental health is a loaded term, and it is a huge barrier for many people, and our mental health system has been abusive to people of color for a long time. And so there's good reason that it carries that there's a barrier there, that it feels loaded. The challenge, I think, I'm not trying to dismiss this at all, but just to say, like, I think we're called out that to create this infant and early childhood mental health consultation program. And there's this whole body of work in this field that exists that we're part of, or that this program is going to be part of. So I don't think we can get away from the term mental health entirely. But I think in terms of how we roll it out to the community, to providers, to families, how we talk about what the services are, that's where we have a lot of flexibility in the language that we use, and in really changing that. So, for example, in Arizona, I believe it's called Smart Start. And so it is like the name of the program is Smart Start. And Carrie, you mentioned another one the other day that I'm not thinking of right now, in another state.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Arkansas calls it behavioral help. There's a lot of smarts and starts out there that people put into different things. So I think Katrina and I were talking about that the legislation asks Oregon in the early learning division to create an expulsion and suspension prevention program, but that they can work with the communities on what is that called, and that the subtitle is what's referenced in the legislation. And I think that's also the flexibility with the mental health consultant term, that there's a Navajo mental health consultant in Arizona who her business card says mental health consultant, but that's not how she talks about it. She has language in Navajo language that doesn't have a great translation back to English that she actually uses with her communities. So I think there's we were wrestling with what has to end up in rules, and then where's the flexibility as implementation works out about what this is people and what this is called and looks like.
I don't think it even needs to necessarily be on a business card.
Right. No, exactly.
But yeah, Leslie.
Thank you for that. And I'm just gonna say that I agree with your description of that. And I'm the one that made that comment. So I wanted to say that mine was more of a, yes, externally facing to families and community. Yeah, we need to call it something different, but we know, like in the field, what we're doing. But in order to receive it, it can't be called that. And so, yeah, we understand that, but I think you get what I'm saying. And I understand that you do as the way you just described that. So that's exactly what I meant, externally facing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, I spent many years as a mental health consultant, and when I would meet families or when I would talk with providers about introducing my role, I would say I'm a behavior specialist, or I'm an early childhood consultant, or I would say, you can just describe me as somebody who understands kids' behaviors. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways of helping us move, not putting mental health up front. Yeah. All right. Thank you. TA provider. Technical assistance provider means a person or entity who provides training, consultation, coaching, or other professional development supports to early care and education programs and providers. A technical assistance provider may be employed by a child care resource referral agency, an ECSE program, other agencies, or maybe an independent contractor. And lots of good feedback here. Does culturally responsive include support in family and provider preferred language? Yes, it does. Although, of course, we have challenges in the actual, like pulling that off and making it happen. Other agency in the list, a couple of comments about that. Specifically call out culturally specific organization or agency. Start with this. The order of the list is important. I really appreciate that comment. Include state agencies, organizations, businesses, options that allow families to be comfortable in seeking support. Calling out culturally specific supports would also empower communities, organizations, et cetera, to provide services. Yeah, that's true. People, organizations or groups that may not even see themselves in that role, but could indeed have a supportive role. Clarify difference between culturally responsive and culturally specific. As needed or as the child needs. I think this was a suggestion of consider adding this language in. Are we helping families or just providers? I'm going to answer that question a little bit. How do you navigate having challenge in accessing those things? Do we define as needed, or is that prompted by the providers seeking help? How would you write about area? City versus rural versus deep rural? How do we look at the culture? How do we include that? There are really distinct differences in Oregon, from urban to suburban to rural to deep rural. Those are some significant challenges for us across the board. TA providers can do consultation too. How do we delineate the difference between Iecmhc and TA provider? Yeah, I think there's some work we need to do on that. And describe how TA provider gives successful consultation. Is it, for example, an hour once a week? So getting more specific on what does that mean? Yeah, I think some of those questions are going to be answered in this. Yeah, no, go ahead and go on to the next one. Thanks, Carrie. So I was thinking it might be helpful to kind of just see one example, and this doesn't capture everything. So this is my concern in sharing it is that it will feel too limiting, and it's not supposed to be limiting. This is just one kind of possible way of conceptualizing this. So let's start from the upper left here. ECE provider identifies a need for support. This could be that there is a child that is that they're concerned, like, we're not going to be able to keep this child here. Or it could be that they're not concerned, the provider's not concerned about being able to keep the child in care, but is concerned that this is a child that's having a hard time soothing and wants some more support. So those are just two examples. But the provider identifies a need for support. The provider then submits a request for support via the warm line, which we'll be developing as part of this program. Once that request is received, it is then the mental health consultation providers and the TA providers, they collaborate to identify the best person to respond. So in some cases, it might be somebody from a culturally specific organization. It might be a coach from a CCR&R. It might be a mental health consultant. We'll see kind of who that person, in each situation, who that person, the right person would be. Amber, I see your hand. I'll come to you in just a bit. So then the mental health consultant or the TA provider contacts the early childhood provider. Support is provided, and that support is tailored to the individual situation, both the individual situation of the provider, the family, the child's. And I realize the complexity of that, but that's the goal. The result is that the provider feels supported, gets the support and feels supported. And then hopefully the child's placement is maintained, or occasionally, we don't want this to be the ultimate outcome, but sometimes a child will need to transition to another place. But we want to make sure that this transition is something that happens planfully, rather than a provider getting to a point of saying, we just can't deal with this child anymore, they can't come. But to go through a process where we can say, all right, perhaps this is not the best place for this child to stay, but let's make this a carefully planned transition, which makes it a little bit easier on everybody. Amber.
Hi, so I have two questions. My first question is, for the provider to get resources, is there going to be a way that the provider could get support even if the parents don't agree and are not on board, for there to be resources available for their child?
Good question. And yes and no. So when we think about services, we think about child-specific services. So let's say that I'm the mental health consultant that's coming out. If we're going to talk about a specific child, then we probably need that parent's permission. We want them to be aware and agreeable to us talking about this child. But if the parent says no, then I still want to be able to support you in what can we do that's not specific to this child, but that is specific to this setting or this, other tools or training or things like that. So I think there are things that we can offer that are not child specific.
Okay, that makes sense. My last question is, so I like the idea of a transition, if where the child's first placement is not working. My question is, what do you do? Is there like is there a time period? What do we do if the parent or the provider is not is not able to find another placement for the child, due to just there's not enough, there's not an open spot available for either a home daycare or a center or a state funded program? What do we do? What are the timeframes? And then what do you do if nothing's available?
Yeah, those are great questions and very real questions. And they aren't ones that I can answer. Other than just to kind of go back to say the support that is provided will be really individually tailored. So we can't come up with kind of specific timeframes because in every situation, it's going to be different. But let's say that you have a child that's it feels like a transition plan is needed, but can't find, there's not another place, which is a very real possibility. What we want to do then is to go, in a sense, go back to what additional supports can we provide as is in the current situation, either until or instead of a transition.
Okay. I can say as a provider for myself, I can't speak for everyone. I do like the idea that if a parent is not on board, to get their child's services for whatever area that they may need help in, that someone can still help the provider as a whole, as whether the classroom is overstimulating, just tools and ways that we can help still support the child as well as the other children in the class. So I do like that idea, and it may be more helpful and easier to keep a child that a provider may be struggling with, to help it be more successful when it comes to terminating a child. I don't typically terminate just because they're special needs. I only will terminate if they become unsafe to themselves, to the provider, and or to other children repeatedly. So
Right. And
I
what
do
we
like that.
want to do,
Yeah.
what we want to do is get in there and then help address those safety issues and see if we can figure out ways of helping the child and the whole entire situation be safe, rather than ending up with a transition. Leslie, I see your comment. Yeah, other placements really don't exist. Like sometimes there is a different, in some areas, there is an alternate childcare provider that the child can go to, but not that provider has any additional skills, strategies, or resources. Yeah. So I'm looking at the time. It's 10:45 already, and I know we have some more good definitions to look at. I'm happy to talk with anybody individually about kind of that scenario that I just shared, or other kind of questions that may come up. I think one of the things that happens, we call it the suspension and expulsion prevention program, which does make it kind of sound like you only contact the program when you're about to suspend or expel, but really what we want to do is go backwards to, I have questions about how to respond to X, Y, or Z, and reaching out for support at that point, so that it really is a prevention program and support.
Yeah, and we wanted to end with your reflections last time on the mental health consultation and the technical assistant provider definitions, because the first thing we're going to tackle today is that there's going to be kind of regional way of getting the money out to build the system. And so you're looking at kind of the regional service provision of infant and early childhood mental health consultation today. The rule set addresses 3 things. And so we thought it would be helpful to kind of have Katrina end on the mental health consultation and technical assistant provider definitions and what you guys gave us as feedback last, so that's in your head as we kind of move forward. And that really, as you reflect on what you just heard, you can continue to make recommendations on things that you've already given us feedback on. But if you want to clarify or add, please use Remy's feedback form. She'll put the link in the chat, and it's also in your agenda or in the email that she sent out to you, or you can email Remy directly and not deal with the form. And that we'll be using the electronic Post-it notes on the ideas boards again today. And then you can always use the Zoom chat like you've been using during this conversation and when we do the full group debriefs.
So we'll move on to our first conversation, and we have 3 rule set items that related to the regional service providers that we want to cover. I'm wondering, and I kind of just open question to the team, due to time, do we want to read these out loud now, or should we kind of break up into groups and allow folks to go through these in their smaller groups? We'll have 4 small groups, and the plan is to have 15 minutes for these 3 items.
Yeah, and we can, if we run out of time, we can adjust how many definitions we address at the end, and then we have a little wiggle room in our 5th meeting to get to definitions that we don't get to by the end of this meeting, because I think the conversation Katrina set up is important. Absolutely. For this set, as well as for the provider set of definitions that we'll get to in the 5th meeting.
Great. So the first one we have here is the regional service providers. And then it means an entity that provides IECMHC services to early care and education providers and coordinates IECMHC services with other early childhood technical assistance providers to promote early care and education provider access to resources, training, and other technical assistance opportunities. And then this one, I won't read in its entirety, but I'll give a sec for folks to kind of just glance over the eligibility to become a regional service provider. So here you have 3 main areas for folks to be eligible to become service providers in this area. Feel free to glance at this and you'll have some more time to kind of dive in the breakout sessions as well. And then the last one is shorter, it's funding. The Early Learning Division shall determine for each fiscal year the portion of the funds available to regional service providers. So these are kind of just the 3 items related to the regional service providers that we want to discuss and give folks some time to do so. And we'll be breaking up into 4 groups. We're looking at about 15 minutes. I know time flies, so it just never seems like we have enough time, but this will be enough for us to kind of get started. And again, just point out what you like from these portions of the rule set, like anything that's missing, questions that might come up, recommendations on language, add, subtract, anything onto these. And we'll have the facilitators have the links to the idea boards, which will also be helping with taking some notes on there. So we do ask if you can please select a spokesperson again to share back to the whole group. If there's someone in your group who maybe hasn't had a chance to do that, today might be the great opportunity for them to be able to share to the whole group. We'd love to hear from different folks as well. So Remy, are we ready?
Yeah, we're definitely ready. I just wanted to make it clear with our group. First of all, if you're watching the live stream, we're about to have 30 minutes where you're going to see a lot of boring stuff. I'm going to pause the recording, and we had enough people for 2 breakout groups that identify as all identities, and then 1 breakout group that identifies as POC. So just wanted to make that clear with everyone. And we're ready to go whenever you are, Karina.
Okay, let's come back in 15 minutes for this one, Remy.
Okay, cool. See y'all in 15 minutes.
11:05. Thank you.
Hi, Lauren and Ashley. Did you get kicked out of a group or are you returning to the main room?
I just joined. I had another meeting right before this, so I'm late.
Same
for me.
Okay, no problem. You guys joined right as I'm expecting the small groups to come back right now. And so you get to hear the debrief and then participate in our second set.
Perfect.
Got
Thank
it.
you.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Katrina and I are going to facilitate the large group discussion where we hear kind of highlights from your conversations. And I can share ideas boards when we're ready.
All right. Well, so we had 3 groups. Hopefully everybody knows their group number. For anybody that was in a group with me, we were group 3. Who would like to go from group 1, 2, or 3? And once we know, then Carrie will pull up the idea board. And if nobody's sure, then let's go with group 1.
We had group 1 and we had a very deep conversation, pertinent matters. But is there anyone who would like to kind of share from our team? Leslie's raising her hand. Perfect. Thank you.
And I can make it brief. We actually started with most of our conversations about, we feel that this process, actually this RAC was very rushed and we don't feel like we have gotten far enough to be ending so soon. And there's concerns about that process. And I shared that we would like to see the long-term goal of what would be the additional follow-up to this. What is the other, is it another RAC? Is it other community engagement? Because Black Child Development PDX has also raised that as we need to know for to be transparent, what is going on? Because this is not enough time. So that was the first thing. We spent a lot of time on that. But funding, we talked about equitable funding. So that doesn't mean everybody gets the same amount. It's based on need. So if there is a small culturally specific or racially specific provider that needs to travel to get to that community, they may need more funding than the other entity that applies for that. And also this other note could go under the eligibility of the regional service provider. We brought up the fact that there needs to be some flexibility in the type of provider. It should not just be an established nonprofit, for example. What is the innovative thing that we can do to make sure that this service, it doesn't matter who they are, but they have the right lens and the ability to do the work. And so what is a way that ELD can make that funding more accessible to communities, similar to the equity fund, maybe, I don't know. But I feel like that process was, much simpler than some of the other ones that I've seen.
All right. Thank you, Leslie. Group 2. Let's see.
I just realized that our group did not select a leader for this part of the conversation, so I'm gonna sit silently for one of my peers to say, yay, I would like to report out.
All
I
right.
think you can do it.
But I can do it. I think I can do it briefly, if everyone is okay with that. So we talked mostly around the regional service provider definition and the eligibility of regional service providers. We couldn't find our definition for funding in our paperwork, but there is reference to the funding in there. So there was some discussion about how to define eligibility factors, not in rule, but in requirements for contract. And talking about like proven history of responsiveness, proven history of, or some type of way to define timelines in that and how responsive providers may be. Also in having contracts describe required responsiveness timeline for regional service providers. Are we calling a parent back in 48 hours? There was a lot of talk regarding how responsive these providers will be to the childcare providers. And then under the, the eligibility, should there be ways, which I think was just brought up, should there be ways to talk about funding for new organizations, right? Not just what's already out there that provide culturally specific services, provide new services in the future, further definition about how, kind of the already existing programs that are there, how they are, actively working with, their communities and the other organizations that are there that may better suit the family and or the child, along with the provider as well. And then adding under the definition of who could apply, adding, some type of disability specific organizations as an option as well. And then the time just went by way too fast.
Yes, it did. Thank you, Molly. All right, group 3. And we didn't decide on anybody either, but it's, I think, Aaron or Marcia. It's one of you will, and Carrie had to jump off.
Aaron, I was pointing at you, but apparently you didn't get that. So are you okay if I go, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in, but I know I have a delay, so I'm trying to minimize my.
Jump in.
Okay, so when we talked about eligibility, one thing you brought up, I think similar to Molly, was thinking about disability providers or early intervention, early childhood special education staff who have specified training in trauma-informed care or mental health as a regional service provider, so considering that population. And then I'm not sure what the ELD to DELC acronyms, they're not fresh in my mind and under the funding. So maybe Marcia or Katrina can help me out.
So I just brought up, since the name of ELD is actually formally changing to DELC, maybe we should just start putting that in the wording so that it's actually correct.
Yeah. A nice close reading of the text where it says early learning division. The early learning division will pretty soon be no longer. It'll be the Department of Early Learning and Care. So yes, I really appreciate all the text edit suggestions that we've gotten across each of these conversations. All right. Well, thank you all. And more happy to have more conversation with individual people. I know this has gone really fast. Carrie, I see Amber has her hand up. Do we have time for questions?
If Ashley could put her question in the chat, then I think that'll help us. I am reflecting on Leslie's time, and that is why we added a 5th meeting, and that all that time isn't assigned yet. So I think what I wanted is advice for, we can do 30 minutes on the 4 terms, and then that would reduce our time for large group breakout, which I know is part of the public meeting. So I wanted to get people's advice. Do you want 20 minutes and we tackle 2 of the definitions and have a robust, give time for the full group to discuss those two definitions and give more time for that. And then we can come back to the definitions that we didn't get to today at the next meeting. Like, what's the best use for people's time? We could tackle the first, should we tackle the first two definitions and do 20-minute group and come back and we'll have a conversation and then other, instead of rushing all four and not getting to discuss them? Okay, I see.
I do like that. I like making a little bit more time to have a deeper discussion.
Okay. So why don't we take the first two definitions? You'll see four on the ideas board, but why don't we do these two for right now? And then we'll come back to the other two at our next meeting. The legislation asks us to define these terms. And so one is anti-racist. And so the current draft definition means a person whose actions and beliefs actively counteract political, social, educational, and economic policies and practices that place value on the behaviors and values of certain racial groups over other racial groups. An implicit bias means the unconscious mental process resulting in feelings and attitudes about people based on race, age, and appearance. These feelings and beliefs are expressed automatically without conscious awareness and have an impact on other people and groups of people. So what we'll do is we'll leave anti-bias education and anti-bias practices for our next meeting. So when you return to your full group, why don't we do 20 minutes and we'll have Remy tell us what time that means we're coming back. You can document your comments on the first two definitions and then we'll come back for full group conversation.
Okay, if we're gonna be out for 20 minutes, that means we're gonna come back at like what, 11:37, 11:38. I will send y'all some reminders. We're opening up the rooms. I'm gonna pause the recording, and anyone who's watching the live stream, once again, it's gonna be boring for the next 20 minutes. We'll come back and debrief.
So Aaron or Lauren, one of you want to report out?
I think it's Lauren's jam this time.
I can do it.
All right.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I think, is everybody back, Remy?
Should be.
Okay.
I know there's at least one person that had to hop off.
Yeah.
But welcome back to the main group. And let's do what we did before. Do a share out from each group. So I'll give an opportunity before I just call on a specific group. I'll give an opportunity for a group to volunteer. Any group want to go first in the report out? I don't see any like excited hands going up.
I can go. I can get us started.
Okay, thanks, Dominic.
Yeah, sure. So our group, starting with anti-racist, we talked about, it says it means a person. And I originally had suggested it not being a person, but more of a way of being. And then it was discussed that it should actually be expanded to not just people, but also policies and systems as well. And then as you move down the sentence, we talked about that the terms briefly or brief beliefs actively counteract political, social, educational, and economic policies and practices. With that group of words, we had talked about kind of the example that we had in one of the other ones where we are listing specifics and in that way excluding others, or it's possible that they can use the ability to like workarounds, so to speak, when there's just specific terms in when we're talking about beliefs. So we had talked about, what we didn't come up with a term or terms for that, but that's one thing we discussed. And then at the last part of the sentence where it says on the values of certain racial groups over other racial groups. And we had a discussion about how that behavior is based out of a dominant culture belief, a white supremacist belief. And we had talked about just clearly identifying that on this rule, because it states certain racial groups over other racial groups. And I think we all know who the racial groups are. So we had talked about identifying that white supremacist culture over other racial groups, because as we also discussed that this is something that Oregon is engaging in that's new, and we also have that opportunity, and I would also say that responsibility to do what we can to begin adding this terminology into the Oregon legislature as well. So that was a really good discussion on that one. As we move to implicit bias, that first line, implicit bias means unconscious mental process resulting in feelings and attitudes. And it had come up that, in addition, maybe we can add perceptions as well. But then Leslie brought up behaviors, and I thought that would be very helpful to clarify that in this rule or in this definition as well. And I think that was the big stuff. Group, let me know if I missed anything or clarify anything that I said immediately.
You're getting a round of applause from Leslie. All right, thank you. Really helpful feedback. All right, so I think that was group 1. So group 2 or group 3, who wants to go next?
I don't remember our number, but I can go.
Okay, group 3.
Group 3. Okay.
Carrie will pull it up in just a second.
So we, I think group 1 did a better job articulating our questions around that last sentence in the anti-racist definition. That point around racial groups over another. We discussed, there's just questions around, does that really encompass everything that is anti-racist? Are there other aspects to being anti-racist besides just when one group is valued over another? So we discussed that a little bit. But I think Dominic did a better job of diving into that and getting to what my question was. And then an implicit bias, we discussed about that recently. There's been discussion around if implicit bias is something that is inherent. And so it's not really something that's as actionable or as is something that we can really address as concretely as explicit bias and things like that. So we discussed a little bit about what the context might be of implicit bias throughout the rule language and where that came into play. Is it just acknowledgement that it exists in everyone and it's here? Or is it, we're kind of questioning if that's going to come up as a discussion point, how that, that might come forward. And Katrina mentioned that it most likely would be in a definition around acknowledging that it's real and it's here for everyone, and less around any needed coaching or support or actionable items around it. Was there anything else from the group?
I think that's it. I'll just tag on to that last comment a little bit. It's like the definition in rule does not have to be a direct link to a specific action in terms of what the program is going to be. Like, we want to have the definition so that we have the common language, because it is one of the things that is an underlying factor under suspension and expulsion. Leslie.
I want to push back a little bit on that, because just because we all have implicit bias doesn't mean we can't work against it. Because it's implicit means that we're doing things that we're unconscious of. And so people need to shine a light on that, and how it shows up in your practice looks like this or that or the other. And so we just say, and I'm not suggesting that all of that was the suggestion, but I think, we call it out, but then we say, these are the things because this impacts young children in a way that's traumatic for them, that we have to fight against what we do automatically. And there are ways that we are come into the world, and there also are ways that we notice things, or we make inferences, or we are taught something, that we start collecting more of it. And so I think, we're working against what you already have when you came as a provider. You stop collecting more of it and be able to recognize it when it shows up when you're hiring staff. If you notice something, how do you have that conversation? Because we don't want to continue to support adult behavior that harms children.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Martina.
I totally agree, Leslie. And that is why we, as a group, also were talking about some kind of trainings and awareness that a lot of large companies do to combat and to bring awareness to their biases, and conscious or not. And that would be maybe a required training for everybody who works in early childhood. So I totally agree with you.
All All right. So let's go to a report out from group 2. We only have a little bit of time left.
I see a hand up. I see Amber's hand
Oh,
up.
Amber.
Yeah.
She has a chance to.
Sorry. Somebody, Leslie had said something about helping a child and then grade in moving on into their adult, not her exact words, but it just spoke out to me. I know that this meeting is about the RAC. I mean, it's about earlyhood child development, but I also think about there needs to be some follow through with K-12, K through 12, because we can only do so much as an early childhood educator, whether it's public or private. But if it's gonna stop once they go to K through 12, all of our resources, all of our funding, all of our practices, what's the point? What's the point? And that's just as a parent. So I just think that we need to do funding, and our efforts need to go through K through 12 as well, because it also has some issues going on, and they need resources and enforcement as well.
Yes, I see a lot of nodding heads. I think you have a lot of people who agree with that statement. Yeah, we will do our part to, support young children, support the providers, and we'll take on our scope, and we'll do what we can to influence what's beyond our scope as well. Okay, Dominic, thank you for alerting me to Amber's hand. And now group 2.
That I was elected. But it was so great. I'm so glad that Martina and both Amber jumped in, because they were in our group and definitely had, such important words to say. But thank you for, trusting me with your words and thoughts. So when I think a lot of what we discussed and a lot of where we kind of fell into things is very similar to what Dominic was sharing. And that's, under anti-racist, should it be more than just person, right? We're talking, provider as well, bringing that in even more into what, further into the definition that was shared earlier. It shouldn't just be person, right? It should be, how is this provider actively, activated in anti-racist policies, how they're moving through that, but then also the person themselves. So both. And then how can we show active participation in anti-racist approaches within the programs, entities, agencies, their policies, stances, practices. And if we want preventative, we should have required training, which is, I think, Martina was sharing that. Amber shared that when we were in the group. So important that if we're going to, call it out, right, then we need to make sure that it's required. And if it's going to be part of our definitions, and this is how we're moving forward, then we need to make sure that the organizations that are working within this are actively working against this and are, actively utilizing tools in that way. And then with implicit bias, we talked a lot about the unconscious mental process and how we could change that, because the unconscious process is internal, it's not just mentally. And I think that, I think Leslie brought it up, it's about, how we are raised, our cultures, it is religion, it is all of these different things. And it's not just, what we're thinking mentally, it can be, physical reactions, it can be, all of these different things. And so how can we, kind of, and again, we talked a lot about how much is too much and how much is too little, and ensuring, that, do we call it out? Do we not call it out? But again, as Katrina's mentioned several times, if we don't call it out, then it, conveniently gets swept under the rug, which is not convenient for anyone. And so, really recognizing that it's not just that mental process, that it can embody who we are because it's how we're raised, it's how, where we've grown up, and all of the different things that play into who we are and how implicit bias can impact, us, and then how, in knowing those things, how we, consciously act to not have that. And then, adding disability, but even more than disability is really bringing in the word intersectionality to that, and how, we have race, we have gender, we have, all of these things that are called out, but an individual may not have implicit bias, for a woman, but for a Black woman, they would, right? And so that intersectionality, I think, is so important to call out when we have implicit bias, because that's where intersectionality came from, right? So I think that that's really important to, have intersectionality be a part of that. And then taking out the word other people, it's not other people that this impacts, it's people, and or groups of people. So that was a good point that we thought of and had a lot of discussion over as well.
Thank you. Sounds like a robust discussion.
Yeah.
All right. We have about 5 minutes left. Lots of good information to digest and take away, a lot of revisions to make. I'm going to toss it to Carrie.
So just as a reminder that you guys as individuals can also continue to give feedback. And so if there's things that you've heard that through conversation you want to emphasize, or you have new ideas, there's a couple different ways to give feedback. There's the form that Remy has created and that she adds the content every time we've explored it in a meeting. And then there's emailing Remy directly. And Remy is also taking notes of what's shared in the larger group, because sometimes what you're saying is more nuanced than what shows up on a post-it note. So just know that we're using that information as well to inform the editing to the rules. And that we've also really appreciated that the Early Learning Division has a rules advisory committee structure for every piece of legislation, and that this one is particularly deep and nuanced and different than some of the other processes that have been run. And so we appreciate all of you adding a meeting because of the conversations have felt rushed even with adding it. So what we had earmarked for the next meeting on June 13th is the definition of early care and education provided related to this expulsion and suspension prevention program, the requirements for early care and education providers, and then the reporting requirements, I think, that are both for providers as well as the regional entities. So we will get that language out to you. We'll repeat the anti-bias education and practices definitions that we didn't get to today. And we do want to do a review of the feedback received. We're trying to figure out how to do that because this has been a deep conversation, and Remy will have some notes for us about how to close the RAC process out. So that's our plans for next steps.
Hey, and I will just talk just for a second about Carrie's note that I will talk about the next steps in the rec. So right now, I'm still waiting to hear back from our procurement department with a letter of confirmation support. When that comes back to me, I'm going to send it out with some instructions on how y'all can seek reimbursement. Once again, we are doing $50 a meeting. So right now, I think eligible for like what, $250 right now, sick. And we will continue adding that reimbursement as we add RAC meetings. So I will say up front that the reimbursement process, if you've ever gone through it with Oregon Department of Education before, it's going to be a lot easier than if you've done it never done it before. I'm so sorry about that. I wish it was easier. The thing about being government is that we've got to have accountability to public dollars. So there's a lot of paperwork that you have to go through. But once you get signed in as like a vendor or whatever, then it becomes a lot easier to do this process again in the future as you continue to engage with Oregon Department of Education and the Department of Early Learning and Care. So yeah, hopefully I'll have more information on that by the 5th rack. I'm hoping that this letter comes back, but we'll walk you through that process when it comes through. And are there any questions about anything I just said, or any questions about any follow-ups that we can answer for you in these last couple minutes? Okay, cool, thanks.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good Friday. Have a good week.